The nation of Rwanda is a country that knows a lot about suffering. With a population of nearly 8 million people crammed into less than 27,000 square kilometers, resources are scarce, and the average person earns less than $250 a year. The unemployment rate is a staggering 34%, and more than 60% of the population lives below the poverty line. On top of that, the AIDS virus is taking a devastating toll, with some estimates putting the infection rate as high as 10%. The life expectancy for a man born in Rwanda is somewhere between 39 and 49 years of age, and less than half the population has any access to any kind of education. Food is scarce, clean water is scarce, and overall, Rwanda is a country well acquainted with hardship. But perhaps the thing that really plunged this tiny African nation into the depths of suffering was the 1994 genocide that claimed nearly 1 million lives. Today on It Is Written, we're going to look at the amazing story of a nation bouncing back from the chasm of hopelessness to a bright new future. Stay with us, and we'll be right back.
It has stood the test of time. God's book, the Bible, still relevant in today's complex world. It is written, sharing hope around the globe. Presented by Sean Boonstra and Mark Finley. New life for a dying nation.
1994 was one of the darkest chapters in modern history, as tribal tensions in the nation of Rwanda escalated to the point where one of the worst atrocities the world has ever witnessed took place. The centuries-old rivalry between the Tutsis and the Hutus exploded, and in less than 100 days, more than 800,000 people were slain in the streets, for no crime other than their ethnic identity. Helpless mothers were macheted to death in front of their children, and so-called undesirable children were herded into school buildings and set on fire. The carnage was unimaginable. If you want a comparison to help you understand how severe it was, the Nazi death camps in World War II took 3 times as long to kill that many people. 10 years later, the scars of the genocide still run deep in the minds of the Rwandan people. It's etched in their memories, impossible to forget. And when you walk the streets of Kigali, the capital city, it's impossible to find anybody who wasn't affected. Almost everybody lost parents, siblings, or children when roving bands of vigilantes moved from house to house, butchering people with wooden clubs and machetes. There are beggars whose arms and legs are missing because of the genocide. There are orphans by the hundreds begging for food in the streets. And everywhere, the infrastructure of the nation still lies in ruins. But the surprising thing is the spirit you meet with when you talk to the Rwandan people. These are not a people without hope, and recently, the It Is Written team witnessed firsthand how God can bring new life to a nation that has had so much trouble. Today, Pastor Mark Finley joins me in studio for a very special program. Mark, I remember when we were in Rwanda together, and it really changed the way that I see the world. What made you decide to go and preach the gospel in that nation?
Sean, Rwanda was one of the most incredible experiences of my 37-year ministry traveling all over the world. The leadership of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Africa invited me to satellite live from Kigali, Rwanda, the capital city, to all of the African continent. And we chose Rwanda because it was the center of such atrocities, but now is in the process of healing. And we believe that the healing grace of God could flow out from Rwanda to the entire continent of Africa and the world.
Now, it was really an incredible event. I'm glad that I went with you over to Rwanda. The things that I saw were unbelievable. Those meetings really excited the Rwandan people. And in particular, I remember the opening ceremony. Tell us a little bit about what happened there.
Well, the first weekend that we were there was just a moving ceremony. The government of Rwanda welcomed us with open arms because they recognized that we were there to bring health and healing and forgiveness to the nation, to cooperate with them in the ministry of reconciliation that they were doing for the nation. And so the opening ceremony was conducted in one of the largest stadiums, in fact, the largest stadium in the nation. 35,000 people came together. The Prime Minister Makuza, was with us, and it was just a marvelous ceremony. Marching bands came in, and these marching bands, Sean, came in for 45 minutes. There were children's ministry groups and women's ministry groups and all kinds of groups that came in and playing varying musical instruments to welcome us and to pay tribute to what God was going to do. I preached a sermon on how God heals us from the past and how we can look to the future. The Prime Minister of the nation addressed that large audience and welcomed us to Rwanda for this satellite event. We were going to send the message of God, the message of Jesus and His love, via satellite and uplink it to the entire continent of Africa. We had translation into 16 different languages. So that first day was a great ceremony indeed.
As I remember, the Prime Minister stood up and not only invited people to come to the meetings, to come to your evangelistic meetings, he told them to respond too, didn't he?
He did. He said, these meetings will be for the well-being of Rwandans. You will find new life in the meetings, and I urge you to attend.
Amazing, amazing. What was it like for you to preach in that nation? I mean, we didn't stay in that stadium. You uplinked from a special location to how many places again?
We would have uplinked to thousands of sites across Africa, but from the Remera Seventh-day Adventist Church, we uplinked in 16 languages to at least 200,000 people live in Rwanda. And probably there were 1 million, maybe 1.5 million across Africa. It's hard to get your hands on all the numbers.
It's amazing. And actually in that one location at Remera, you had a big crowd.
15,000 people on some nights.
Unbelievable. How did they respond as you presented Jesus?
Positively. You know, the Rwandan people are so open to the gospel. They've been through such terror, and their lives have been so traumatized. And Sean, to think of it, 10 years before, bands of roving rebels ran through the streets with machetes, cutting off people's arms. There were husbands or wives that saw their loved ones killed before them, and the Rwandan people were just reaching out for that healing of soul. I talked to the one who invited me there, the leader of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We call him a union president there, Pastor Amon Rutalingi. And I said, Pastor, did you lose anybody in the genocide? He said, Mark, my wife was brutally murdered.
Unbelievable.
My 3 children were brutally murdered. My 7 grandchildren were brutally murdered. And he said, after the genocide was over, he said, the only reason I wasn't killed is I was out preaching during the genocide, and I was hidden by a Hutu elder. Pastor Emon is a Tutsi, and he said, I was hidden by this elder for 40 days, shifted to 7 different secret locations, and my life was saved. But after it was all over, the rebels were gone. The new government was established. He said, many of these murderers were captured. Prisons were established. And he said, I was brought to one jail. And out in the back of the jail, there were 5 men. Their hands were tied behind them. They were the murderers of my wife, my children, my grandchildren. They had their faces in the dirt, and the police handed me a gun and said, you have every right to put a bullet in every one of their heads. They brutally murdered your wife and your children. And Pastor Amon said, I cannot shoot them. I've already forgiven them. But I have a question to ask. What were my wife's last moments like? What were my children's last moments like? What were my grandchildren's last moment like? And the murderers said, we were so stunned. They were praying for us. They were praying for us.
Unbelievable.
They were singing hymns. Today, the Seventh-day Adventist Church is going into the prisons. There's 180,000 prisoners. There were 180,000. Some have been released now, but 180,000 people that perpetrated the genocide. They were put in prison, 19 prisons. Christians in general, and Adventists in particular, have gone into the prisons with a ministry of healing and forgiveness. And Seventh-day Adventists, Sean, have 19 churches in these 19 prisons. A church in every prison. Some of them are churches of 600 members. People who killed the relatives of those coming into the prisons to minister to them are now saved by God's grace and living lives of forgiveness and reaching out to other prisoners to bring the grace of Jesus to them.
Yeah, as I remember, your evangelistic meetings were actually beamed down into those prisons. We had how many prisoners watching?
Well, the government of Rwanda was so impressed with what God was doing and so impressed with the ministry of love and healing and forgiveness, they allowed us to put satellite dishes in 3 separate prisons. We had the potential of sending the message via satellite in the prisons to 10,000 people in each prison, or 30,000 people.
Amazing.
We entered one of those prisons, and I had a chance to preach in the prison. And before I preached, a prostitute stood up and said, "I'm in prison for prostitution, but the grace of God has changed my life. I'm a new woman in Christ, and I've been studying the Bible for the last 6 or 9 months," and she was baptized that day. I interviewed another young woman, 28 years old, and I said, how long have you been in prison? She said, 10 years. I knew it would be because of the genocide, but I asked her, I said, "Why are you here?" She said, "The genocide." In other words, she took machetes in her own hand and slayed people. She took the machete and cut the throats of people. I said, "Why are you here?" She said, "Because of the genocide." But she said, "I've been here 10 years. At first I was aloof, I was an angry woman, but I watched Adventist Christians, and I saw their love and their kindness, and I've studied the Bible with them for the last few years, and today, Pastor, I'm liberated. I'm a free woman because I'm being baptized today in Jesus."
That's amazing. That's amazing. Mark, let's talk a little bit about the nation of Rwanda and what they went through. There was a man in Rwanda working at the American consulate who we became friends with, and who told you one day, "I'm going to show you 2 things, the saddest thing you've ever seen and the happiest thing you've ever seen." What was the saddest thing he showed us? What was that thing he said was going to be so heart-rending?
You know, Sean, that morning was probably one of the saddest of my life. Now, I've been to the Nazi death camps. You know, I've been to Auschwitz and some of the other Nazi death camps, and they are moving experiences. You cannot go through those experiences without crying. But the difference that took place with me in Rwanda is this: the remains of 10,000 people are still at a church in a place called Nyamata. 10,000 people fled to the churchyard. And when you walk into that church, there's blood on the walls. Mm-hmm. There are bullet holes in the roof. There's a room where the clothing was left for the last 10 years of those that died, and it's blood-stained, it smells. Up until a few months ago, the remains of the people were left there. Now they have them in a crypt. And you and I went down together into that crypt, and we saw skulls of people that were on trays, and there's the remains of 10,000 people there. And Sean, you see babies and children, 3 years old, whose heads were cracked open with machetes. You see babies with bullet holes in their skulls. You see, and it is so moving to think that they died there. And you know, Sean, I can't help but think that on resurrection morning when Jesus comes, that place that has been such a place of horror and sadness and difficulty is going to be an incredible place of joy when the dead are resurrected and reunited with their loved ones and with their Lord.
You know, Pastor Mark, I've got a pretty steely constitution, but I remember when I went down into that crypt with you, that was pretty tough. It was a tough place. I remember looking at all of those heads, and I was doing really well until I saw one little skull. Must have been a 2-year-old child. And you know, I've got a 2-year-old myself. And I thought, what in the world brings people to do things like this? And we discussed something in that crypt. I remember you saying, you know, what would it be like if the Spirit of God were completely withdrawn from this world? Look at what people face. Look at what happens. And we went from that place. That was a very downcast place. That was a tough morning. I left with tears in my eyes. I know that you did. But we went from there to see what kind of hope comes out of darkness when God is at work.
There is. But Sean, we did. And Sean, one more comment on the Nyamata Church.
Sure.
I would not want to leave our audience in despair on it.
No.
If I were not a Christian, and I went there, you know, I'd be filled with this kind of wrenching despair. But as a Christian, I know 2 things. First, that everyone who died there did not die in vain. That God was with them. And that out of the blood that was shed, the world learns lessons about racial harmony, about the fact that ethnic tensions and divisions only lead to death. There's another lesson, I think, that comes out of that, and that is that the Rwandan people today are reaching out in forgiveness, and that nation can be a model for the world for forgiveness.
Absolutely.
And I think also their blood cries out from the ground for the hope of Jesus coming. We did leave there, and we traveled, 3 hours over rough roads. And
I remember the roads. They were not,
And we traveled out to a place where it was really a jungle setting, and a field. And I remember coming across the field, and we looked, and there were 300 women sitting under the trees.
Yeah.
And they had these fine strands that they were knitting together and weaving together from a plant called the
Sisal
plant. Yeah. And they showed us how they did it. Now, these women were making little baskets that could be little Christmas ornaments to hang on a tree, and they're being marketed here in America. And a husband writes a note to his wife how much he loves her and puts it in the basket and hangs it on this little ornament, or what he wants to do for her of kindness, graciousness, and love in the next year. She writes a note to her husband of love for him, and they put them on these little ornaments. They hang them on the tree as kind of messages of commitment. But the thing that impressed me of these 300 women, I learned that about half of them had husbands that were killed in the genocide. They were all widows. Some of them had babies sucking at the breast as they were weaving. And they have children they're trying to support. The other half were not Tutsi widows. They were Hutu widows, and their husbands were in prison, and some of them had been put to death because of the genocide. So you have Tutsis and Hutus, widows sitting under the trees. They are weaving together. And half of these women have bank accounts now. Amazing. It was amazing to me, but the thing that was so amazing was to see the love, the bondedness between them. The resentment, the anger, the bitterness of the past is being put aside. And Rwandan men and women are finding reconciliation and forgiveness and peace in Jesus.
That was an amazing scene. I remember how those ladies were so excited when you arrived there with your team that they leapt up, they began to sing. And these were people that 10 years ago were at odds in a very real way. I mean, in a way that was costing 800,000 people their lives. And today, they work together on a new future. It's amazing how the Spirit of God can work in a nation that has been through such tough times, and how forgiveness has become a part of society. And I'm thinking in particular now of a real story of forgiveness that you ran across there in Rwanda with Adele.
Sean, Adele is one of the most remarkable women that I've ever met. Let me tell you her story. Pastor Man Rutulingi, my host, said to me, "Pastor Mark, I want to take you to a woman that is so remarkable that you will be deeply impressed for the rest of your life with her story." Her husband was a pastor. He was brutally murdered, massacred, macheted to death before her eyes. And the story that she will tell you will change your life. So I traveled on rough roads, over ravines and out to a little African village. As I entered Adele's home, I noted the picture of her pastor husband on the wall. I stood there for a few moments looking at the picture. And then I sat down, and Adele and I made small talk. And then I said, "Adele, I know your husband was brutally killed. Would you like to share his story with me?" And with a tear in her eye and her lips quivering, she began to share that story. And she shared how the rebels came closer and closer to her village. She and her husband fled into a Catholic church. The rebels entered that church. Adele thought there would be sanctuary there. There was not. As the rebels came in, they began screaming for the pastor to stand up. Nobody stood. They continued to scream because they were going to kill all the community leaders first. The pastor stood, and the rebels ran and began to flay at his body with a machete. They struck him again and again and again. And finally, his throat was cut and bleeding. Blood was spurting from his body, and he was breathing his last, praying for those that killed him. Adele began to scream. And in that melee, in that confusion, 45 people were slain, 15 fled. And as Adele told me the story, she pulled back her black hair, and I saw a scar across her forehead and a scar that went deeply into her skull. They ran at her with machetes, and she was left on the floor for dead. She had a large scar on her head. She had scars on her back. Her wrist was partially chopped off. And for 3 days, Adele lay among the dead bodies. Her heart was faintly beating. When the townspeople came to bury the dead, they found Adele lying there. They picked her up in their arms. They bathed her wounds. They brought her to the hospital. By now, the rebel leaders had moved on. It took 3 years, but Adele recovered. And she began to think, I can be a bitter, angry, resentful old woman. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go into the prisons and minister healing to the murderers. And so there was one prison not far from her house, and Adele became known as the mother of that prison. She brought in food. She brought in clothing. She ministered lovingly to the prisoners, and she said, Pastor Mark, one day a young man fell at my feet, and he was weeping and kissing my feet. And as I looked down at his face, I saw that he was the young man that rushed with a machete and killed my husband. He was the young man that put this scar in my head. And he looked up and he said, Adele, would you forgive me? I pulled him up and I embraced him and I said, in the name of Jesus, I'll forgive you. She said, Pastor Mark, my heart was racing, but I knew that Christ had forgiven me and I could forgive him. I began studying the Bible with prisoners, and Lewis came to the Bible studies. And Lewis made a decision that he would follow Jesus and be baptized. But he said, before I'm baptized, I want to stand before the prison publicly and ask you, Adele, for your forgiveness. And the day of his baptism, he stood with Adele and he said, Adele, I brutally murdered your husband. I put a knife mark, a machete scar on your head. Would you forgive me? And she said, before those prisoners, before he was baptized, I forgave him. My son took his father's death so hard. And Lewis said, I want to talk to your son. And my son went to his cell. And Lewis said, I want you to forgive me. Lewis became a model prisoner. The grace of Christ was flowing through his life. He was a new young man. After 3 years, the government let him out of prison for good behavior. But he had no place to live because Lewis had his father and mother murdered in the genocide. And I said, Lewis, you come and I'll adopt you as my son. And for the last couple of years, he has been living in my home. Pastor Mark, would you like to meet Lewis? And I'll tell you, friends, there was a lump in my throat and tears in my eyes, and Lewis walked into the room, and Adele embraced him, and she said, he is my adopted son today. I've thought so many times in my life, maybe I thought I was mistreated. So many times in my life, people have said something, and I've got upset. So many times in my life, people have done a little thing, and I've been angry. And I thought of Adele, how she could reach out in such loving forgiveness. Is there somebody that's hurt you today and wounded you? In the Spirit of Jesus, you too can forgive them. The lesson of Rwanda is the lesson of a nation learning to forgive because Jesus has forgiven them.
That's absolutely remarkable, Mark. Thank you. You know, the ancients had a story about a bird that would die in flames and then come back to life. Now, that was nothing but ancient mythology, yet there's just a little kernel of truth to it. God can take the darkest moments of anybody's existence and breathe new life into them. If God can give new life to an entire country, a nation that killed off 1/8 of its population in an act of unbridled passion, He can certainly breathe new life into you. Maybe today, like thousands of prisoners in Rwanda, you've done something to ruin someone's life. Maybe at this moment you're even sitting in prison yourself. And as you search the recesses of your heart, you can see that you need something better than you've got. Maybe you've been hurt, and you're struggling to find forgiveness for the people who did it. As you listen to the stories of forgiveness and healing coming out of a nation like Rwanda, today you sense that you would like to experience that kind of love and forgiveness too. Today, this is the moment God has chosen for you. As you quietly reach out for His hand, He is reaching back for yours. And His promise is that He can make you a new creature. The Bible says in 2 Corinthians 5:17, "Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. Old things have passed away. Behold, all things have become new." Now just imagine, if God can make a whole country new, He can do it for you. Pastor Mark, somebody watching today is struggling for a new beginning. They'd really like to have a new start. They'd like to know what forgiveness is about. Either they need to learn to give forgiveness or receive it, and they're really struggling at this point. We should pray for that person.
Let's do that, Sean, right now. Father, teach us that not to forgive is to live in resentment
Amen.
and that resentment simply destroys who we are. Teach us, Lord, that forgiveness is healing. It's life-giving. Give us the courage to forgive others, just as Jesus faced the cross courageously and forgave his tormentors and crucifiers. Oh, my Father, place within our hearts the gift of forgiveness so we can be gracious and merciful to those that have wronged us. And may that be life-giving to our hearts and souls and minds. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
You know, sometimes at life's darkest moments, people are tempted to think that God is some sort of an absentee landlord who started the planet spinning and then took off. How do you explain all of the horrible messes we have to live with every day? Is there any rhyme or reason to our existence? I've got good news. We've got a Bible course that will take you through all the major themes of the Bible in a systematic way and will pull back the curtain of the universe to show you how God is still in control. This easy-to-do study course is designed to be done in the comfort of your home, at your own pace, and it's absolutely free. All you need to do is ask. Here's the information you need.
You may request today's offer, the Discover Bible Guides, by calling our toll-free number 1-800-253-3000. Call right now. The operator needs only your name, address, and phone number, plus the name of today's offer, the Discover Bible Guides. Lines are open 24 hours daily. They may be busy, so keep trying. You may also request today's offer by writing to It Is Written, Box O, Thousand Oaks, California, 91359. Our free offer is for an address in North America only. The Discover Bible Guides are also available on the Internet. Just visit our website, itiswritten.com. Also online is a complete script of today's program. If you wish to help the worldwide outreach of It Is Written, your tax-deductible gift may be sent to the same address, or you can make a gift online at itiswritten.com. Thank you for your letters and continued support. Our toll-free number is 1-800-253-3000, and our web address, itiswritten.com.
It's been an inspiring program today, and unfortunately, that's all the time we have. But I hope you'll plan to join us next week again as once more we look at a God of love and forgiveness. And remember, it is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God.